"Mom, did you check the mail today?" Daniel asked casually as he poured himself a cup of coffee, the sunlight streaming through the kitchen window, catching the faint gray in his hair. I froze, staring at the envelope in my hand, my fingers trembling slightly. I hadn't received anything. No letters, no notices, no sign of the documents he mentioned. Victoria was beside him, smiling as if everything were normal, yet the corners of her mouth tightened just enough for me to notice. My heart sank, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I set the envelope down and looked around the kitchen, the familiar oak cabinets and worn countertops suddenly feeling foreign, alien. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, all seemed to amplify the silence between us. I could feel the tension like static electricity in the air, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. I remembered the past few months, the small things that had shifted, invitations arriving late, minor financial updates never reaching me, casual mentions of trips I was never included in. Each detail had been brushed off, explained away, or simply ignored. Now, all of it converged into a single, piercing question: what had been kept from me? I picked up the envelope again, weighing it in my hands, noticing the crispness of the paper, the official-looking print. I slid my finger along the edge, careful not to tear it, as if handling it with gentleness could coax the truth out. Daniel sipped his coffee, unaware of the storm inside me, chatting about his work and the upcoming family gathering, his voice light, casual. Victoria adjusted her scarf, her movements deliberate, her eyes flicking briefly toward me, betraying a flicker of unease. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs, grounding myself. I reminded myself to stay calm, to observe, to take in every word, every glance, every small gesture. I couldn't react impulsively, not yet. There was power in silence, in waiting, in gathering all the pieces before making a move. My gaze drifted toward the window, where the sun painted patterns across the floorboards, the familiar light a reminder of the steadiness I had carried. Through decades of family life, of challenges and joys intertwined. Yet today, that light felt harsher, exposing cracks I had ignored for too long. I noticed the way Daniel's shoulders shifted slightly when Victoria mentioned the house, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion that spoke volumes. I understood then that there was more than a simple oversight. There was intent, subtle, calculated, hidden beneath politeness and routine. My mind began to catalog the irregularities, the moments that no longer made sense, the laughter that felt too rehearsed, the questions that had never reached me. I set the envelope on the counter, my hands steady now, and allowed a quiet resolve to form. I would not confront blindly. I would not act out of anger, but I would uncover the truth. Every detail mattered. Every glance, every slip of the tongue, every letter, every silence. I would watch, I would listen, and I would prepare. The weight of the unknown settled over me, a heavy, silent presence, yet within it stirred a determination, calm and controlled. The kitchen, once a place of ordinary routine, now felt like the stage where a quiet reckoning would unfold, where the subtleties of deception and hidden intentions would be revealed not in shouts or arguments, but in observation, patience, and calculated action. And as Daniel poured himself another cup of coffee, unaware, I let my gaze drift to the envelope once more, knowing that this small, overlooked piece of paper held the beginning of a story that would change everything. The days that followed felt heavier than usual, a quiet tension hanging over the house that I could not shake. I moved slowly through the rooms, my hands brushing against the wooden surfaces, feeling the familiar textures, but sensing something different in the air. Breakfasts were eaten in silence. Daniel focused on his laptop, Victoria scrolling on her tablet, the sounds of coffee brewing and toast popping up from the kitchen appliance the only noises filling the space. I set my own plate carefully, noticing the way the sunlight fell across the counter, catching dust motes that danced lazily in the beams. Each movement, each small gesture became a reminder of how isolated I had become, not because of neglect alone, but because of the subtle exclusion that had crept into my life over months, almost imperceptible until now. I recalled the conversations that had passed by unremarked, the invitations that never arrived, the fleeting references to financial matters that left me confused, the trips and events I was told I would be included in, yet never saw. The quiet hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, the ticking clock more pronounced, marking the passage of time in a house that no longer felt fully mine. I went to the window and looked out at the street below, the trees rustling gently in the breeze, a reminder that the world continued beyond these walls. Yet my place within it felt tenuous, unsteady. I remembered the evenings after Daniel would return from work, the way he had once shared stories, asked advice, or included me in discussions that made me feel needed, connected, part of a family. Those moments had grown sparse, replaced by hurried conversations, distracted glances, polite nods, and silence that stretched too long between words. Victoria's presence added a layer of careful management, subtle steering of conversations, directing attention away from me, the smallest of gestures hinting at control, though always polite on the surface. I brewed myself a cup of tea, watching the steam rise in thin spirals, feeling the warmth in my hands while noting the chill in the room that seemed to seep into my thoughts. I went through old letters and notes tucked away in drawers, little reminders of shared history, times when I had felt secure in my role, respected and seen. The contrast was stark now, a quiet ache settling deep inside. I walked slowly to the living room, pausing at each photograph on the wall, faces frozen in smiles, laughter captured in images that now seemed like memories from a life apart from this new reality. Each photograph, each object, each routine became a measure of distance, a reflection of subtle changes that were invisible until stacked together. I sipped the tea, feeling its bitterness on my tongue, a sensation oddly comforting as it mirrored the complexity of my thoughts. There was no anger, no outburst, only observation, careful, deliberate, noting the ways the family interacted without me, the patterns of omission, the small discrepancies that added up. I made mental notes of inconsistencies, of moments that did not align with the past, each one a clue, each one a silent alarm. The sunlight shifted as the morning moved toward noon, the room growing warmer, yet the weight in my chest remained. I focused on the ordinary, the arrangement of chairs, the dust on the shelves, the ticking clock, the tea cooling in my cup, and in doing so, I kept my mind sharp, aware, ready. I knew that before any confrontation or revelation could occur, understanding had to be complete. Observation was my tool, patience my ally. As I set the cup down, I realized that the quiet of the house was no longer oppressive but strategic, giving me space to think, to plan, to notice. The subtle exclusion, the quiet shifts of power, the unnoticed movements, all were pieces of a puzzle that I would solve, carefully, deliberately, and with full awareness. In that stillness, I felt a growing resolve, a calm determination that I would move through this time with awareness, that each small gesture, each observation, each quietly noted inconsistency would guide my next steps. The day continued, ordinary in appearance, yet charged beneath the surface, a day in which the quiet patience of careful observation laid the foundation for the truths that would soon emerge. The next morning, I found myself standing in the sunlit living room, the golden light spilling across the floorboards, highlighting the faint scratches and marks that told stories of years past. Daniel had left early for work, leaving Victoria quietly preparing her breakfast, her movements precise and controlled. I walked to the bookshelf, running my fingers along the spines of old family albums, pausing at photographs that captured moments of laughter and togetherness now tinged with distance and quiet unease. The house felt strangely large, the echo of my footsteps a constant reminder of the subtle isolation that had crept in unnoticed. I brewed a fresh pot of tea, the aroma familiar and comforting, yet my mind wandered to the discrepancies I had noticed over the past weeks, the letters never arriving, the financial updates that seemed slightly altered, the casual mentions of events I had never been invited to. Each small detail was a fragment of a larger pattern, one that I was beginning to piece together with careful attention. As I carried the steaming mug to the kitchen table, I noticed Victoria glancing up from her tablet, a hint of something unspoken crossing her expression, quickly masked by a practiced smile. I sat down, placing the mug in front of me, feeling the warmth seep into my hands as I let my gaze drift to the window, observing the street below, the neighbors going about their morning routines, oblivious to the quiet tension inside the house. I reflected on the moments when Daniel had shared his day, sought advice, or simply connected with me, realizing how those interactions had gradually dwindled, replaced by hurried exchanges and polite nods. I began sorting through the pile of unopened mail, examining envelopes and statements, noting the subtle irregularities, the missing signatures, the small errors that seemed innocuous until seen together. Each discovery added weight, yet I maintained a steady calm, observing without reaction, knowing that the power of awareness was greater than any immediate confrontation. I walked to the kitchen counter, arranging the cups and utensils with deliberate care, letting the routine of preparation ground me while my mind processed the emerging picture of oversight and omission. I noticed how Victoria moved around the kitchen, her gestures controlled, her focus on her own tasks, yet the occasional glance in my direction betrayed unease, a silent acknowledgement of the discrepancies she could not explain. I sat back down, sipping the tea, letting its warmth flow through me as I cataloged everything I had observed, the timing of deliveries, the conversations that left me with unanswered questions, the subtle adjustments in behavior that now made sense in context. The quiet of the house, once oppressive, became a canvas for reflection and strategy, a space in which I could calmly observe, plan, and prepare for the necessary steps ahead. Each small movement, each pause, each glance became a clue, a guide for the careful, deliberate process I was beginning, a process of understanding, patience, and quiet empowerment that would gradually reveal the truth. I let the steam rise from my cup, watching it twist and curl, a visual echo of the thought patterns spinning in my mind, connecting the fragments of evidence, the inconsistencies, and the subtle tensions into a coherent awareness of what had been hidden from me and what would require careful attention to uncover completely. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor as I moved deliberately through the living room, carefully straightening cushions and adjusting a vase of fresh flowers that Daniel had given me last year. Each motion was ordinary, mundane even, yet beneath the surface my mind was sharply alert, tracing the patterns of behavior, the inconsistencies, the subtleties that hinted at hidden intentions. Victoria was arranging the dining table for a small tea, her movements precise and deliberate, yet I noted the slight hesitation when she glanced my way, a subtle tremor in her smile that betrayed the composure she projected. I settled into my favorite armchair, a worn leather piece that held decades of comfort, and let my gaze drift over the room, observing, cataloging, analyzing. The framed photographs on the mantel told stories of a life shared, laughter captured in frozen moments, each image a reminder of trust, of history, of the warmth that had gradually been replaced by distance and unspoken tension. I reached for the stack of envelopes that had arrived over the past weeks, running my fingers over the edges, noting which ones remained unopened, which ones had been redirected, each small irregularity a silent alarm that reinforced my growing awareness. As I sipped my tea, its warmth spreading slowly through me, I reflected on the countless little moments that now made sense in a new light, the invitations that never came, the conversations that were subtly steered away from me, the financial matters never clarified. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, each second a measured beat marking the passage of time, a reminder that every action, every oversight, every omission had a rhythm, a pattern. I thought of Daniel, busy with work and obligations, unaware of the silent calculations unfolding beside him, and of Victoria, whose carefully managed demeanor hinted at awareness without admission. I traced the sequence of events, imagining how the pieces fit together, how the small signs of omission and subtle manipulation pointed to a broader reality, one that I was only beginning to fully comprehend. The tea cooled slightly in my cup, forgotten for the moment, as I allowed myself to focus entirely on observation, on mapping out what had been hidden, on quietly preparing to navigate the path ahead. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic outside, ordinary noises that contrasted sharply with the heightened awareness that filled me. Each breath, each glance, each minute adjustment of the objects around me was deliberate, reinforcing a sense of control even as the broader picture of deception and hidden intention came into focus. I remained seated, hands wrapped around the warmth of the cup, letting the calmness of measured reflection settle over me, knowing that understanding every detail, every nuance, every subtle cue was essential before any steps could be taken. In that quiet, sunlit room, the ordinary actions of arranging, observing, and reflecting became a strategy, a framework for the careful, patient work of uncovering the truths that had been concealed, a preparation for the revelations that would eventually come to light. The next morning, I left the house with a folder tucked under my arm, the crisp air of early spring filling my lungs as I walked down the quiet street to the local bank. The sidewalks were still damp from an overnight drizzle, and the faint scent of wet earth mingled with the aroma of coffee from the corner cafe. I carried with me the small collection of documents I had gathered over the past weeks, receipts, letters, and statements that hinted at discrepancies I could no longer ignore. Entering the bank, I greeted the tellers politely, offering a calm smile that belied the storm of focus in my mind. The fluorescent lights reflected off the polished floors as I approached the customer service desk, presenting my identification and requesting to review the accounts under my name. The clerk nodded, typing efficiently, eyes scanning the screen with professional attention, and I followed every movement, noting details, patterns, anything that could confirm or deny the suspicions I had gathered. Minutes stretched as information loaded, and I maintained a steady calm, each breath measured, each gesture precise. When the clerk finally looked up and confirmed that the accounts were indeed in my name, with transfers and documents I had never authorized, a silent tension coiled in my chest. I did not flinch, did not exclaim, only absorbed the information fully, letting it crystallize in my mind. The discovery was significant, yet the way it was hidden, misdirected, altered subtly over months, revealed the extent of the careful planning by Victoria. I left the bank with the knowledge in hand, walking slowly, deliberately, taking in the surroundings, the blooming cherry trees lining the streets, the sound of a distant lawn mower, the chatter of neighbors beginning their day. Each ordinary sound contrasted with the extraordinary realization I now carried. I began to map out the next steps in my mind, considering carefully how to address the situation without immediate confrontation, observing, gathering, and planning, knowing that patience and clarity would be my greatest allies. Returning home, I moved through familiar rooms with new awareness, placing the documents carefully on the table, arranging them in a sequence that made the hidden patterns visible. Victoria was in the kitchen, humming softly, unaware of the clarity I now held, the quiet understanding of what had been manipulated, diverted, and kept from me. I made tea, the warm steam rising, mingling with the sunlight in a soft, golden glow, and settled at the table to review the evidence, noting each irregularity, each small inconsistency that had led to this moment. I felt a calm resolve, a quiet determination to act with measured precision, to ensure that the truth would be recognized and that the balance would be restored, not through anger, but through awareness, preparation, and careful, deliberate steps. The ordinary motions of the morning, the pouring of tea, the turning of pages, the soft ticking of the clock, were now imbued with a new purpose, each movement a part of the careful observation and strategic planning that would guide the next stages of this quiet reclamation. Back at home, I carefully laid out the documents across the dining table, the morning light streaming through the windows illuminating each page and statement, casting subtle shadows across the room. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock formed a backdrop to the meticulous organization of the evidence I had collected over the past weeks. Victoria entered the room, arranging a small tray with teacups, her movements deliberate, the faintest hint of tension behind her otherwise composed expression. I watched, noting every gesture, every pause, every slight flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, cataloging them silently as part of the larger picture that was slowly revealing itself. I moved my chair closer to the table, hands steady, and reviewed each document carefully, tracing signatures, dates, and the flow of transactions with precise attention, ensuring that nothing was overlooked or misinterpreted. Each discovery reinforced the understanding I had begun to form, showing not only the scope of the manipulation but also the subtle ways in which attempts had been made to divert attention and maintain the appearance of normalcy. I made no move to confront. No words were spoken, only observation and quiet analysis, letting the weight of the truth settle and solidify in my mind. The aroma of tea reached me, the warmth in my hands providing a grounding counterpoint to the heightened awareness that filled my thoughts. I considered the implications of each finding, mapping the sequence of events and understanding the strategies that had been employed against me, all while maintaining the outward calm that allowed Victoria to remain unaware of the full extent of my awareness. The room, ordinary in appearance, was now a stage for careful calculation, each movement and observation forming part of the subtle reclamation of authority and insight. I allowed myself a slow sip of tea, the liquid warmth mingling with the clarity of understanding, reinforcing my sense of control and measured purpose. Outside, the breeze moved the branches of the trees, the distant sounds of neighborhood activity continuing without pause, a contrast to the meticulous focus within these walls. I methodically arranged notes and evidence, grouping documents and highlighting key points mentally, committing each nuance to memory and letting the awareness of timing, sequence, and intent deepen. My gaze occasionally flicked to Victoria, whose subtle gestures continued to betray a fragile composure, a quiet acknowledgement of the subtlety of the situation without awareness of my complete understanding. I allowed a moment of calm, letting the rhythm of preparation and observation settle over me, feeling the quiet power of patience and insight as I traced the patterns and connections in my mind. Each detail, each observation, each quiet note became a building block in the strategic understanding that would guide my next steps, ensuring that any future action would be precise, deliberate, and effective. I finished my tea slowly, leaving the empty cup on the table, and allowed myself a few deep breaths, embracing the clarity, the patience, and the silent strength that had begun to shape my approach, knowing that from this calm observation, careful planning and subtle empowerment would emerge naturally, preparing the ground for the resolution that was steadily taking form in my mind. By mid-morning, the house had settled into a quiet rhythm, the sunlight shifting through the windows and illuminating the carefully arranged documents on the dining table. I moved among them with deliberate care, reviewing each page, noting dates, amounts, and subtle notations that hinted at actions taken without my knowledge. Victoria was in the kitchen, the soft clinking of teacups marking her movements, and I watched without interruption, observing the slight hesitations, the measured steps, the way she adjusted her scarf, small gestures that spoke volumes without words. I made notes silently in my mind, cataloging the evidence I had gathered, connecting patterns, and establishing sequences that revealed the extent of oversight and misdirection I had experienced. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional chirp of birds outside, ordinary sounds that contrasted sharply with the careful attention I was paying to each detail. I allowed myself to reflect on past interactions with Daniel, the ways in which conversations had shifted over time, the subtle distancing that had begun slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it became unmistakable. Each observation was recorded mentally, a detailed map of behaviors, omissions, and small acts that contributed to the overall picture. I took a moment to step back from the table, looking at the documents spread out before me, the light catching the edges of the papers and highlighting the patterns I had started to trace. The clarity of what had been hidden from me became more apparent, the threads of intent and oversight connecting in a web that was quietly revealing itself. I poured a fresh cup of tea, its warmth steadying my hands and providing a tangible sense of grounding as I sat and reviewed the accumulated evidence once more. My attention flicked to Victoria as she moved through the kitchen, her expression carefully composed, yet her subtle unease visible in the smallest of gestures, the way she paused briefly before speaking, the hesitation in her tone. I allowed these observations to solidify in my mind, reinforcing the understanding I had gained and shaping the strategy that was beginning to take form. Every detail mattered, the order of documents, the dates, the slight inconsistencies, the unspoken cues. The ordinary environment of the house, sunlight, furniture, kitchen utensils, the quiet tick of the clock, became a backdrop against which the true dynamics of control, influence, and subtle manipulation were revealed. I sipped my tea slowly, feeling the warmth, appreciating the stillness, while maintaining acute awareness of everything around me. The quiet observation, the careful attention, and the deliberate cataloging of details were transforming the ordinary morning into a strategic foundation, preparing me to navigate the forthcoming revelations with precision, patience, and silent authority. In that calm, sunlit space, I felt a growing sense of confidence, an understanding of the intricate dynamics at play, and a readiness to proceed with clarity and measured purpose, knowing that the insights gained in this quiet reflection would guide the actions and decisions to come. By late morning, the house felt lighter, yet every movement within it carried an undercurrent of quiet tension. I arranged the papers on the dining table in chronological order, allowing myself to see the full scope of the details I had collected, tracing the flow of decisions, transfers, and omissions that had quietly unfolded over time. The sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating the edges of each document, casting faint shadows that seemed to emphasize their importance. Victoria moved around the kitchen preparing a light snack, her polished movements deliberate, and I observed closely, noting the subtle hesitations, the small adjustments of her posture, and the careful timing of her steps. Every gesture was a clue, a piece of the larger pattern I was uncovering. I sipped my tea slowly, its warmth grounding me as I cataloged in my mind the events and inconsistencies that had led to this understanding. The ordinary rhythm of the house, the soft ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the occasional chirp of a bird outside, contrasted with the heightened awareness I maintained, each sound reinforcing the quiet vigilance I had adopted. I allowed myself to reflect on past interactions, moments when conversations had shifted, invitations had been subtly delayed, and details had been omitted, realizing now how these small acts collectively revealed a pattern of oversight and manipulation. I traced the connections between the documents, the dates, and the behaviors, forming a coherent picture in my mind, a strategy beginning to take shape without need for immediate confrontation. Each small observation, each seemingly inconsequential gesture from Victoria or Daniel, now held significance, forming part of a broader map of the quiet shifts in influence and attention. I adjusted my chair, moving closer to the table, and reviewed the documents once more, letting my focus sharpen on the details, tracing the sequences, confirming the consistencies and discrepancies with careful attention. I felt a steady confidence building, a quiet empowerment grounded in awareness and preparation, knowing that understanding the full scope of the situation was the key to any future action. The house remained calm, ordinary in appearance, yet every object, sound, and movement contributed to the environment of observation, strategy, and readiness. I reflected on how each subtle omission or misdirection had been carefully executed over time, and how, now that I had pieced the information together, I could move forward with clarity and purpose. The light shifted as the morning progressed, the room bathed in a soft glow that illuminated not only the documents but the careful attention with which I approached them. I let the warmth of the tea settle in my hands, breathing slowly, feeling the patience and quiet authority that had developed alongside the understanding of the situation. Each small observation, each careful note in my mind, became a part of the strategy, forming the foundation for the measured steps that would eventually follow, ensuring that any actions I took would be deliberate, precise, and fully informed. I allowed myself a moment of calm reflection, appreciating the ordinary details of the house and the quiet rhythm of the day, even as I prepared mentally for the next stages of uncovering and addressing the hidden truths. As the afternoon progressed, I moved through the house with a quiet purpose, carrying the weight of understanding and awareness like a subtle current beneath the calm surface. The documents were neatly stacked on the dining table, their presence a reminder of the careful observations I had made over days and weeks, each one a small piece of the larger picture that was gradually coming into focus. I walked slowly to the window, resting my hands on the sill, observing the neighborhood below where children played and neighbors tended their gardens. Ordinary life continuing oblivious to the intricate dynamics unfolding inside. Victoria entered with a tray of small sandwiches and tea, her movements practiced and polite, yet I noticed the slight stiffening of her shoulders, the brief hesitation before placing the tray on the table. Every small gesture was significant, every nuance a clue that reinforced the pattern I had begun to recognize. I sat down with my tea, allowing the warmth to ground me as I reviewed each detail again mentally, connecting the sequences, noting the inconsistencies and intentional diversions that had been woven into the daily routine. The subtle shifts in conversation, the delayed notices, the omissions, all began to coalesce into a coherent understanding that required careful thought and measured responses. I observed Victoria as she moved around, the faint adjustment of her scarf, the careful modulation of her voice, the slight pause before speaking, all revealing more than the words themselves could convey. I allowed myself to reflect on past interactions, remembering the moments when guidance and trust had been shared and how those had diminished gradually, replaced by oversight and quiet redirection. The ordinary rhythm of the house, the ticking clock, the hum of appliances, the filtered sunlight, served as a backdrop for the quiet strategizing, each sensory detail sharpening my focus and awareness. I revisited the documents, tracing lines, verifying dates, recalling the context of each letter and statement, allowing the narrative to crystallize fully in my mind without haste or interruption. The sense of control and clarity grew steadily. A calm authority formed from patient observation and deliberate attention, enabling me to anticipate reactions and prepare for careful, precise next steps. I allowed a slow, measured sip of tea to accompany the quiet reflection, noting how ordinary objects and routines now held new significance in the framework of understanding the subtle manipulations that had occurred. Each moment, each glance, each movement reinforced the comprehension I had developed, ensuring that my awareness was complete, my readiness precise, and my patience unwavering. As the sun shifted and lengthened the shadows across the room, I remained seated, hands folded around the warm cup, internalizing the strategy and clarity I had cultivated, knowing that from this calm observation and careful mapping of the interactions, the next stages of revelation and measured assertion would unfold naturally, with deliberate and controlled intent, guided entirely by the understanding gained through careful and sustained attention.